Hi and welcome back to my channel. In this video you have the first of 3 top 10 videos. I realized as I was going through my books for the year, no, the year is not quite over. I'm about halfway through December at the time of filming, but I realized that if I want to talk about all of the books that I really loved and made an impact this year, I would need to split it up. And so I have split it up 3 ways. I have 2 top 10 videos and 1 video that's a top 5 of 2 different but related categories. And I'm going to start with that category first, or that video first, I should say. And that one is my nonfiction and my historical fiction. So I'm going to go in order of lowest ranked to highest. Obviously though, these are already at the top. And I'm going to start off with the nonfiction. And the first of those is technically a 4.5 star read, because I didn't quite have 5-star reads for my nonfiction, but the first of those is one that I got at the Strand last year around this time, actually, and that is The Song of the Cell by Siddhartha Mukherjee. I think that's how it's pronounced. On Cowpile, I rated this 8.57 out of 10, a 4.5 star, a very high 4.5 star. And in this book, this is a very sciencey, information-based book, but he tells it with stories of his time as a doctor looking and working with these different patients. I don't think this one is quite as good as The Emperor of All Maladies, which is the first book and the book that he is most well known for, but I really enjoyed his take on this aspect of science. It's a little dense and not necessarily for everybody, but I enjoyed it. Then we get to an even higher 4.5 stars. Literally probably just 1 point more would have made this a 5-star, and that is This Place, 150 Years Retold. This is a compilation, anthology, historical nonfiction graphic novel about the history of Canadian First Nations. And this taught me so much. I absolutely loved this book. On Cowpile, I rated it 8.86, and at 9 is when you get to 5 stars. The only reason that this was not quite a 5-star is because a couple of the stories in here were not my taste in art style. One of them specifically I just didn't really understand. Another one I understood. It wasn't my style, but I clearly understood what the author and the artist was trying to do with that story. But this tells so many intense stories that so many people don't know. I highly recommend this book. Then we get to a book that several people in my family have read this year. It is a 9.0, which is the base of 5 stars, and that is A Woman of No Importance, the untold story of the American spy who helped win World War II. I did not think that a book about World War II, especially a nonfiction about World War II, would be one of my top books. But I really enjoyed how Sonia Purnell told the story of Virginia Hall, the spy in this. It shone a light on the history that you wouldn't necessarily have expected out of that. And I really appreciated that. Next, we have a book that I have on order. I really wanted to have all of the books here, all of my 5 stars here, before I filmed this video, but they hadn't quite come yet and I needed to film. And that is Invisible Women. And I wish I remembered the subtitle, but I don't remember that off the top of my head. My mom read this one and I read this one as audiobook. It is phenomenal and so aggravating. The way that different research has been conducted and our world has been created and structured that ignores women, the invisible part of it, it is impossible to walk away from what you learn in this book not angry and not wanting to ardently campaign for change. It's very, very well written. And I knew when I was thinking about my top books of the year that this was going to be on it and that this was going to be my favorite nonfiction of the year. Overall, it is my 10th highest rated, and that is Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. On Compile, this scored a 9.43. I really appreciate the way that David Grann told this story. The way that he wove together all of these different pieces in this unfolding cold case about these people who had been taken advantage of in some of the worst ways. He also didn't elaborate on it and try to make it flowery and sensational. He told the story. And another thing that really cemented in my mind the fact that this is my number one nonfiction book is when, towards the end of it, he talks about his personal journey into telling this story and the fact that he found so many people, so many records or lack of records of people who were just swept under the rug, and all of their wealth and their personhood was taken, was stolen from them, and that there was no way to get it back for them. No way to actually document all of this. And his own heartbreak at this, he's like, I can't achieve justice for these people. I can't go in and research and find this evidence that's going to make it right, that's going to absolve anyone, that's going to give them justice. There's no way to do that. And it's heartbreaking, but at the same time, it's so realistic and so hard-hitting. I'm so glad that so many more people have read this book this year. I wish, from what I've heard, that the movie had done a better job, but I'm glad that they made an adaptation because more people picked up this book. Then we come to historical fiction. And in this one, you have my number 2 book of the year, but that's going to be my number 1 in this category. And in this, you have one book that I read as part of my SEASL project this year, and that is African Town by Irene Latham and Charles Waters. This technically was a 4.5 stars with an 8.29. So out of the 10 total that I'm talking about in this video, it's the lowest rated, but this is so well done. Not only is it co-written, not only does it have a huge cast of characters, but each of those characters has a different voice. The poetry, because this is told in verse, the verse style, the poetry style for each of the characters is so unique and identifiable to that person. And I really appreciate an author's note where these authors said, we don't have relatives. These are not our stories. So we are treating this with care. And I happened to read this around the same time as my worst book of the year, which I am not going to talk about ever again. I was so irritated with that one. She was not the person to tell that story. These people were like, we don't actually know if we're the people to tell this story, but because we know that this is not our story, we are going to research and handle this with care and be honest with the fact that we do not know everything. So this story, this novel tells the story of the last slaves, some of the last slaves brought over illegally because in the Constitution it banned the importation of slaves in 1808. But I forget his name. He was like, I want to make some money anyway. And so he brought over some slaves in, I think, 1856 or 1858. So fairly soon before the Civil War. And these people banded together. They lived as slaves for a few years. And then they banded together afterwards and created a whole life and village. And this book, not only does it talk about characters who were brought over on that last ill-fated slave ship, but it also talks about their descendants. And it also brings in descendants of the guy with an enormous hubris who did this and brought them over and was so upset when he got in trouble for it. This is just really well done. This is a young adult historical fiction. In fact, all but one of these is young adult historical fiction. So the next one that we have here is Angel of Greenwood by Randy Pink. This is the second Randy Pink book that I have read. This is set in Tulsa in 1921, around the time of the Tulsa Race Massacres, which I've talked about several different times with some of the books that I've read. It is something that I feel horrible for the fact that I knew nothing about this until I started teaching 7th grade ELA, and one of the books on that list was Tulsa Burning. I read the book, before I assigned it to my students so I'd be able to discuss it with them. And in that book, which doesn't even center in Tulsa all that much, but it brings in the Tulsa Race Massacres, I knew nothing about them. Nothing at all. Since then, I have been wanting to gain more information about it. And the way that society tried to cover over, especially in Tulsa, tried to cover over and didn't tell anything about these massacres for years is absolutely horrific. In this book, you have two different teenagers. There is a bit of a love story, and it's leading up to the race massacre itself. And I think if I remember correctly, you don't actually know what happens to them afterwards. I know that it's never known what happened to the original girl who cried out and the boy that was accused of doing something to her. No one ever knows what happened to them. This is just very hard-hitting and very well done. That one got a solid 9 on Cawpile. The next book was difficult to read, incredibly hard-hitting. Technically, I think this is middle grade, but I would think it's upper middle grade. And it is also told in verse, and that is The Door of No Return by Kwame Alexander. So many books that I have read by Kwame Alexander have grabbed me and just like emotionally devastated me. And this one is no exception. The main character in this verse is royalty of some sort in a tribe, and he is captured along with a few other people by another tribe who then sells all of their captives to the Europeans. I don't remember which ones, whether they were Portuguese or British. And it tells his story of being completely ripped away from his family and going through the eponymous Door of No Return, which they were taken to these places on the coast and awaiting being loaded up on the ships to be brought over to the Americas. And there's a portion of the book, a significant portion of the book at the beginning, where he's in his life with his family, and you know what's coming because you've read the synopsis or you know what the Door of No Return is. And when it actually happens, even though you know it's coming, it still is so emotionally devastating. One of the most hard-hitting books I've read all year. My number 2 historical fiction is another book that I read for the SEASL list, and that is Bluebird by Sharon Cameron. Again, this is one that I have ordered, but I do not yet have. Bluebird is the kind of book that I don't think necessarily that I would have been drawn to, and yet it utterly intrigued me. It even had one of my least favorite tropes of an unreliable narrator, but the way that it told the story was so utterly captivating. But in this, you have basically Operation Bluebird was the name for what went on to be part of the CIA and led into the LSD trials of the CIA on soldiers, and it was like mind control. And a lot of things that the CIA did post-World War II, they kind of make you go, oh, we did that? Really? Because there are so many documented evidences of how they brought over Nazi scientists in various scientific disciplines and gave them a free pass because they could help them in their science against the Soviets. Never mind the fact of what these people had been doing to the Jewish people and other people in concentration camps already. And the way that the relationship unfolds for the main character with the love interest with her sister, it's absolutely fascinating and devastating at the same time. This is the second book that I have read by Sharon Cameron that has really challenged my thinking, and they've been quasi World War II related, and yet these are ones that I will continue to pick up because of how she approaches the writing and the storytelling. I've already put her next book, which is coming out next year, on my anticipated releases list. And then the book that was my number 2 book overall this year, and my number 1 historical fiction, Take My Hand by Doris Perkins Valdez. In this story, this is based on a real life occurrence where you have this young nurse who, this is the protagonist, she had a little bit of privilege growing up where she wasn't poor. Obviously, there were microaggressions and other racist actions towards her growing up in the South, but they had a bit of wealth, and so they could avoid some of that. Well, she ends up getting her first nursing job in a family planning clinic. And Roe versus Wade, I think, had just been passed at the time of starting this book. And it's also dealing with the way that Black women were treated when it came to should they bear children. Other people making that decision for them. And in this book, there's a story, there's an actual court case where, and I think in the actual court case, it was a social worker who was dealing with these two girls. They were 14 and 12, I believe, or they might have been a year or two younger than that. But they were bigger physically than the average girl at that age. And so a lot of awful assumptions were made about their so-called promiscuity. One of them was, I don't know that she had an actual diagnosis. She was, I don't know the right way to say it. She was not a person that was going to be going out and making these sorts of decisions for herself. And yet there was this drug, I think it starts with a D, where it would be injected and that was supposed to be a contraceptive. But there were studies being done around the same time that showed horrific side effects. And she, the nurse in this book, chose not to give it to those girls. And then something irreversible happens to them, and they were taken advantage of because their parents didn't know how to read or write. They were given this form, told that it was about the shots, but it was really consent to hysterectomies for girls, underage girls. I remember sitting there reading it and just becoming so viscerally angry at the things that were happening. And when an author can pull me that much into a book, hands down, it is something that I am going to remember for quite a while. It is not surprising to me that this was my number 2 book overall. I think you will see a theme in my top books, especially my top 3. I'm not going to mention what the other 2 are. They're not happy, fluffy type books. I think I have a type as for the type of books that I enjoy. So there you go. There are my top 5 nonfiction and my top 5 historical fiction books. In the next video, I'll talk about my top 10 fantasy books. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.